Before we begin, this video may contain some subjects talked about in great detail that might make people uncomfortable and could be a little bit odd to cover in such great detail. However, in order to parse through the allegations regarding jobless reincarnation and its main character, we do have to go to some places. So, if you are the type of person who finds things uncomfortable and will automatically assume that I'm supporting them by analyzing them in detail and being objective about something, then please, this video isn't for you. Jobless Reincarnation, the series that filters people like nothing else. I mean, aside from being one of the greatest isekai stories out there, what with one of the most well-structured worlds and a very true-to-form fantasy story, there is one significant thing that this story is known for. We're talking about its main character, Rudeus Greyrat. Again, because in spite of constant online discourse, there are plenty of people who still cling to the idea that he's the worst character ever and that he's responsible for some downright awful stuff. There's plenty about Rudy that isn't perfect. He's definitely been a pest with his own set of crimes by our standards. However, some people take things a little too far. In order to cover this topic as thoroughly as it needs, there are some things we'll have to get answers for first. Number one, we'll have to answer the question of Rudy's actual age, which requires two inquiries in and of itself. So we'll have to talk about Rudy's connection to his past life, as well as what we as a society generally use as a metric for what we consider an adult. After that, with the preliminary information sorted out, we can parse through Rudy's actual actions in the story and compare them to the allegations lobbed against him. Then, once we've laid out all of the information and the cases against him and determined what he's actually guilty of, we can talk about the purpose of those incidences within the context of the story and how people have reacted to it. So without further ado, let us begin. So question number one, how old is Rudy? The first major issue many people take up with this series is the idea of Rudy's classification as a person, whether he's an adult or a child. So in reality, it's better phrased not as how old he is, but as is he an adult or a child? We'll need to answer that before moving on to anything else. Many will simply resort to the 40-year-old man in a child's body argument and leave it at that, but I honestly think that this definition is terribly short-sighted. It does point to the fact that at the very least he should know better than to behave the way he does, an entire core concept of the show where Rudy's character revolves around the idea of him being less mature than he actually thinks he is. But more than that, this 40-year-old man in a 6-year-old body sounds awfully familiar, don't it? Where have we heard that argument before? Right, my least favorite subject of all time. Lolicon. The issue I have with this particular argument is it comes from the same people who would be upset if you showed them a lolly and claimed it was a 400-year-old dragon that just so happens to look like an 8-year-old girl. And look, I'm not wanting to get into the whole lolicon thing nor make a major stance here or now, because the vastly conflicting definitions that I've found online that range from purely platonic inclinations towards a cute young animated character, to people like myself who prefer petite women like Frieren and Tatsumaki, all the way to an actual sexual attraction to artwork of prepubescent children taking massive pipe, have made it really hard to figure out what actually this shit is. And look, I don't trust any sources on this matter either, since there's literally no reason for anyone involved to not obfuscate the truth, especially if it is the worst case scenario, and this requires me to do some digging into the history of it and reading some of the literature from which the term is derived, and that's all work that I don't feel like doing for this video and isn't terribly relevant. So we'll just leave it at that, because, well, none of that ramble was really the point. There's only one reason I bring up the lolicon stuff right now. I've seen many of the same kinds of people who make the argument against Mushoku Tensei based on the fact that Rudy is quote-unquote mentally older, i.e. the types of people who will cry and piss and moan over the quote-unquote sexualization of children if you show someone under the age of 18 in a slightly revealing outfit. Meme on the fact that lolicons will use the argument of 1,000-year-old witch and so on and so forth. And to turn around and use the same justification for a character to be an adult is honestly utterly hypocritical and destroys your credibility. And honestly, I don't even think mental maturity alone is a good thing to judge by. Back to the issue, though. The first step I decided to take in this was to look into the link between Rudeus Greyrat and the unnamed shut-in that he used to be. To do so, I decided to read up on some of the Buddhist ideas of reincarnation because I wanted to understand the mindset of how this religion views it. Buddhism being one of the two primary religions in Japan that could have been a somewhat influence on how the author views reincarnation. According to what I was able to find, the belief is a bit more complicated than just a soul being transferred to a new life. Buddhism makes a point in generally believing that it isn't a direct reincarnation, although Buddha himself was able to access the memories of his previous lives in spite of this. It seems more commonplace that it's not simply a recycling of the soul. Generally, that idea of reincarnation, the one that comes from the English/Western modes of thinking, is kind of a different concept altogether. Effectively, some tenets of Buddhism assert that nothing is actually transferred across lives, but there is a sort of causal link between them. Basically, the essence of a being, but not the soul nor consciousness, is transferred. And based on your karma from your last life, that essence is given a new fate and form. Really, the term for it in this situation is more properly rebirth. And this is in line with the later statement from Rudeus himself, as he comes to realize that the old shut-in he has memories of was not actually Rudeus Greyrat in any particular way, and that he was merely pretending at adulthood by standing atop a mountain of memories and regret. This puts an interesting distance between the man Rudeus Greyrat and the life he still holds memories of. But the title of the series is legitimately Jobless Reincarnation, the idea of a soul reborn, so why bring this up? Well, I think it sort of helps to frame some of these things into the context of the writer's point of view, especially as some concepts exist in Eastern thinking that don't actually in Western thinking. And if I could actually read Japanese, I'd have loved to delve much more deeply into this subject because translation can play a part in how these ideas are communicated. Needless to say, dominant religion in an area can highly influence morality. That's why you have difference in standards between the Western world, which is dominated by Christian principles, Middle Eastern morality dominated by Islamic principles, and the various different kinds of religion in Asia, be it Hinduism, Shintoism, or Buddhism, depending on which region you talk about. So a bit of a look into the culture becomes somewhat necessary to a degree, what with culture informing morality, but we don't need to get into the whole subjectivity part of that in this video. It's not relevant. And I find it important to try and take into account those cultural differences since the way the author sees it is important. So that brings us to Rifujin Maganote's thoughts on this and how he frames the whole situation. And we kind of find some evidence along this same line throughout the story. Of course, he retains memories from his old life, yet he's still to some extent a very different person. The real kickers are in specific lines delivered about the nature of his life. Like in episode 9 of season 1 when Rudy first meets the man god and he's told that his astral form is based on how he sees himself, not on how he actually is. Him being the old shut-in has nothing to do with who he actually is and more so how he sees himself, and it would be impossible not to given the memories that he has of his old life. This is a very interesting distinction. His soul doesn't actually take that form other than based on how he sees himself. Meaning that if he were to see himself as Paul Greyrat's son, as he does in Season 2, Episode 24, when he says that he's just a brat playing pretend at being an adult, it would ultimately change his astral form and soul. This lends to the belief that Rudy and the previous life are only really connected by memory and nothing more. But this alone is not exactly a final nail in the coffin of all the accusatory arguments. Like I said, it's preliminary. Something to keep in mind as we go forward with this discussion. Again, we're talking about phrasings that are very interesting and lines of dialogue that don't seem to be made a huge point of, but are highly relevant to this particular discussion. It seems to paint the picture that the memories in Rudeus himself are somewhat separated, but that's about as far as we can go with this line of thinking, really. Effectively, Rudy is a person influenced by the memories of his past life, but not so closely linked to that past life that he is exactly the same person in a different body. But that last bit is kind of a moot point in a few cases because while he may be a different person altogether and much more separated from his previous life than many would think, he still very clearly retains those memories and should know better as an adult, per se, than to do the things he does. So that brings us to our second issue of clarifying Rudy as either a child or an adult. The standard of maturity in the real world, and more often than not, we do not consider the mental age of someone the only criteria by which they are considered an adult. The issue stems from the fact that I think there are some issues with only using one criteria, because if you rely too much on one standard, it falls short. The issue with mental maturity being that it becomes hard to define, what with there being illegal exceptions to someone's age as to whether they're considered an adult in any country. Some places have laws that allow you to get married before the age of majority, and that by proxy makes you a legal adult. And even if you wanted to use one standard, like the US's age of consent at 18, you're going to find it actually varies from state to state. A general standard for the world becomes even harder when it comes to age of adulthood because across time, the idea of mental maturity has varied. Thanks to modern scientific developments, we know someone isn't fully mentally mature until their mid-20s, when their frontal lobe is finally done developing. Romans didn't even consider someone a fully legal adult until the age of 30 at one point, and it was later revised down to 25. But even then, they considered the end of childhood at the age of 15 and had ceremonies by which boys were deemed adults. So here's a bit more of a history lesson for you. Age of consent, or age of adulthood, or just the general concept of who's considered an adult, since they're generally concepts that are closely correlated, fluctuates very drastically from society to society and even across time. Hell, the legal distinction didn't even really come up until the medieval lawmakers decided to really hammer home the difference between what could be considered an adult and a child. So this idea of being an adult has largely fluctuated around several concepts, one of which being the capacity to make decisions for yourself via the accumulation of worldly experience. That's part of the reason why a lot of countries don't allow people to sign contracts, own firearms, drink until certain ages after their point of adulthood, all of that kind of stuff. But when it comes to sex, marriage, and general independence, it seems it was actually far more common throughout time to consider the physical maturity of anyone involved than anything else. But even in this day and age, there are wildly varying ideas of who can do what and at what age. In the Philippines, age of consent is as low as 12 years old, something I personally think is incredibly ridiculous. In Germany, it's 14, with some extra legal elements to protect the youngins in the case of a major age gap that could lend to the exploitation of some young people. In Japan, it's 16, as with what some people in my live stream chats who happen to hail from Europe have said about their own home countries. And in most of the United States, it's 18, while in Texas, it's 17. But back to the medieval lawmakers, they decided to use puberty as the hard line between adult and child. But even that becomes a bit erratic because puberty can set in as early as 8 years old in some cases. But I think it's generally on the right track because being physically mature is important. Ultimately, the lawmakers in question decided upon the age of adulthood being 12 for girls and 14 for boys because it was about this time children were developed enough to be considered adults, even considering the different ages at which people begin to mature physically. And this is ultimately why I argue it's better to use the actual points behind the decisions that our countries have made rather than the actual real-world numbers we have selected, because by defining what we consider an adult, we've come up with a point by which you can actually assess something in this fictional scenario. So in case you're not following, the definition I'm arguing for of an adult is someone who has the ability to reproduce, as well as the ability to make decisions for themselves in an informed manner. Basically, I think that both mental maturity and physical, or rather sexual maturity, are very important for considering someone an adult. That's why I would never consider someone like Kana Kamui from Miss Kobayashi's Dragon Maid an adult, because she is capable of neither of those things, in spite of the fact that she is well above any age of consent laws, considering she's 400 years old. But why does sexual maturity matter? Well, it means that you physically hit the point of your life where you can be considered fully grown by the fact that you are capable of sexual reproduction. We consider non-human living things adult or mature once they reach sexual maturity, so in cases where neither the intelligence nor morality of a creature is regarded, we resort to its physical maturity, its ability to reproduce. For humans, by the age of 18, you are considered qualified by both standards. Your body is capable of sex, and in general, your mind is developed enough to be able to handle the biological and emotional ramifications of any such actions. This is why PDF stuff is inherently one of the most horrendous crimes you can commit, because it's a sexual desire for or act involving someone incapable of both physically bearing and mentally handling the idea of sex, giving birth, and child rearing. That's why PDF stuff is bad. It's not so simple a fact as interests in children are depraved because society arbitrarily says so. It's the fact that it causes legitimate harm to the child in ways that we can prove and consistently find in these cases. They fundamentally lack the physical ability and mental ability for such things. Children's bodies are not capable of having other children. Their minds are not capable of comprehending it or bearing the weight of its consequences, regardless of how knowledgeable or mature they may seem. And no, children are not capable of making such weighty decisions in an informed manner and therefore incapable of consent. Children, human beings yet to go through puberty, should not be involved in these sorts of things. I think I've made that pretty clear. Those reasons are why we consider it the most reprehensible act a human being could possibly commit, and why these types generally get beaten or shanked in prison. So 18 years old isn't just a purely arbitrary number put in place by the government to stop you from enjoying the forbidden fruit. It's rooted in these fundamental reasons of protecting young people until they've both physically matured and accumulated enough life experience to be capable of managing on their own, making informed decisions about things that will totally alter their life. So why go through all of this information? Well, because people stuck in their ways about jobless reincarnation will insist it's bad in the face of just about any argument because it makes them uncomfortable, and they like to do their moral grandstanding. I get it, we all want to protect the children, myself included. But we need actual reasons and proof to say Rudy is a PDF file or a groomer, and that requires a few things. One being definitions that will help us determine whether he is an adult or not, and thus make a standard we can use reliably. So I'm making a definitive proof we should all be able to theoretically agree on, one that generally incorporates our real-world sensibilities into a format that can be used fairly on fictional settings. Not that it helps, because then these people will just turn around and say that Jobless Reincarnation is the only series that needs a legal proceeding to prove that it isn't PDF stuff, but I digress. Is this all starting to come together now? Has my long-winded spiel finally connected? If you want to make the argument that Rudy is an adult, you ultimately make an argument that physical maturity has nothing to do with it, and that mental maturity is the only metric, and there are issues with that. I've already laid out how Rudy is more attached to this life than the last, through reincarnation, so regardless of whether you want to cling to the feeble idea that he's somehow much older, you're only producing massive issues with your own argument with a double standard. I wanted to examine the reasons we have behind our own laws and the morality that upholds them, and I formed these points from what I derived from them. All that said, how does this apply to our defendant, Rudeus Greyrat? Well, I think we all know the answer. He aces the mental capacity check, what with his past life memories, but flunks the physical part of it, which effectively means he can't actually be considered an adult until about 15, when his world actually considers him an adult. There is something to be said about the biochemical elements of this whole argument, but most of what Rudy is accused of takes place before puberty sets in, so we can somewhat dismiss this element as a moot point. The fact is, Rudy's still a minor when a lot of these things that people will accuse him of happen. His world's age of adulthood is 15, which comes from the fact that this world is themed after a medieval European setting. As for the main points that we've established, here's what we've got so far. Rudy's connection to his previous life really only exists in the memory of it. Rudy, in spite of whether he is or isn't the same person, should know better because of those memories. Rudy is a child in this series up until he turns 15 in this world. So that's one of the major sticking points of this series resolved. Like I said, a lot of the arguments against Rudy and his morals is effectively predicated on the idea that he is an adult in this setting. Because in order to accuse him of being a groomer or a PDF file, both of those things require that he's actually considered an adult. It's not PDF stuff if it isn't an adult acting on a sexual desire for a prepubescent child. Yeah, that's a very specific definition because it's a very specific heinous crime, okay? Now, sleeping with any old miner is still statutory rape. It's still very, very illegal to go on your Dr. Disrespect arc here in the United States, regardless of whether they are 8 or 15. But just like you couldn't accuse two 16-year-olds of any of these crimes for sleeping together, you can't do the same to Rudy if he actually isn't an adult. Now, there's still a line of thinking that can be applied even there, that none of it matters because Rudy thinks he's an adult, but does believing that I'm a dinosaur and also the second coming of Jesus Christ actually make me either of those things? At some point, objective reality rules over personal belief. Whether Rudy thinks he's an adult or not, he isn't. He's an immature boy with the memories of another life. There's a flaw to trying to frame Rudy as an adult that I've already covered, no matter how you want to slice it. Most arguments predicated against Rudy are based on the idea that he's an adult. But now that we've gone through that, it brings us to the next section of the video, going over the accusations and the actual crimes he's accused of.